what we'll do today is we will kind of start with some of the basics, some of the kind of fundamentals, run through some of the kind of key things to bear in mind, and then we'll talk about what does the kind of full package look like. What does everything, if you were to do everything, what does that look like? And if you were to do a small amount of work, what would that look like? And just to be super clear, when I say package, I don't mean like package with Trust Keith. This is not a sales webinar. I mean like a full thing. If you were to do everything in data protection, compared to if you were to focus on a few small things, what are the differences, and what would that mean for you? So cool. Theme of this we'll start off with is like, how do you know if you're actually compliant anyway? Like what do you actually need to bear in mind? So hopefully you can share my screen. Matthew, Mitch, thumbs up if you can. I can see. Yeah, perfect. Cool. So I generally say that there's 4 steps to understanding whether or not you're compliant. First one, grab yourself a stiff drink, sit down, realize that there's absolutely no such thing, and then next from there. It's very important to bear in mind that GDPR data protection in general is not a set of rules. There's no kind of clear black and white with a lot of these things, and that is something that people need to kind of recognize early on, and you kind of got to get over that part. There will always be gray areas, there will always be interpretations, because the law is principle based. So your approach is going to be risk based. So unfortunately, if anyone does try to sell you a really quick solution to something, or a software that's going to do this for you or do that for you, fundamentally you're still going to be faced with a lot of gray areas and a lot of questions. So part of data protection is actually just getting comfortable with that, and getting kind of used to that as the actual reality. It's risk-based, as I said, because if we take, for example, the GDPR, it's based on principles. So these are the principles that you'll find in the GDPR. So it has to be lawful, fairness, transparency, has to be purpose, limitation, data, blah, 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 blah. You'll find, actually, interestingly, that these are not new principles. These principles go back all the way to 1981. So as much as GDPR is kind of touted as this big, new, game-changing thing, realistically, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was Europe-wide, and it was extraterritorial, so it applied to American companies who worked with European customers and stuff. That was a big deal, but generally speaking, a lot of the law isn't that new. If you were to, example, which I'm not sure I would recommend, but it's entirely up to you. If you were to go and dig up the Australian Privacy Act of 1990, for example, you'd see basically these same principles in there. So it's worth bearing that in mind, because it means that some of the stuff I'm going to say a bit later around what are the kind of foundations of data protection are going to make sense if you bear in mind the fact that it's always tends to be based on the same sort of thing. But of course, if it's principle-based, it makes it quite difficult to know what to put in place, because there's no list of what's expected in an organization from a data protection perspective, or no kind of tick boxes or rules. So really, you want to be focusing on kind of the foundations of data protection, and kind of focusing on those as a starting point and building out from there. So we'll talk about those a little bit later, and kind of what we've broken down the foundations to be, and why, and to give you some pointers on kind of where to start. Just before we do that, let's just cover off what we're talking about when we're talking about data protection. I got asked the other day for the first time, as Mitch will verify, and it was a question that was interesting, because it's just never come up before. But the person asked, well, what is data protection? And I was like, that's interesting, that question has never come up. But it also meant I never had to answer it. So I had to have a think about it. And so I thought it might be useful just to go through what is data protection. In the UK, as one example, there's data protection in practice is defined in a few different things. So you've got the Data Protection Act 2018. You've got the UK General Data Protection Regulation. Sorry, that shouldn't have an S on it. Data Protection Regulation. You'll notice that they sound kind of similar. They are kind of similar. The UK GDPR is basically the same as the EU GDPR. It's just changed ever so slightly to take out lots of European specific stuff and lots of European references. But also you have the Data Protection Act 2018. And that's things that are a lot more specific to UK law. So there'll be things around like intelligence services processing, equality and inclusion, things that are kind of specific to the UK. So it takes the GDPR, expands on a lot of the areas, adds more to the framework. So sometimes you have to think about both when you're processing information. You've also got privacy electronic communications regulations, the PECR, super important rule if you do any kind of marketing or anything. If in effect this governs online marketing, electronic marketing, any kind of digital marketing is actually covered by this law, not the GDPR, which is a common mistake that people make. So another one to be aware of. Then in the UK, we have a common law of confidentiality. The UK's got a relatively interesting legal system in that we don't have a constitution that's kind of codified. It's uncodified. It's loads of different written bits of paper everywhere, most of them stored in UK Parliament. And so we generally have things like a common law, which is just a common understanding of confidentiality. And there are things that there's a general perception that you should and shouldn't do. This one is particularly important if you're thinking about dead people. The reason being is that the GDPR says that it applies to natural persons. Natural persons are legal people who are alive. If you're dead, the GDPR actually doesn't apply to you, which hopefully won't be a huge question in your industry. But unfortunately, we will have customers that do pass away and things like that. What do you do in that case? Well, actually, the GDPR is no longer applying. So we're thinking about common law of confidentiality. And that's where questions around like probate and stuff like that come into question. And also, just to add to the list, we've got various court cases. As with any law, when you have a law come into place, quite a lot of the time, people like myself, we sit and wait for court cases to clarify certain things. So there are lots of things that have been clarified by court cases or made precedent by court cases. And again, the way the legal system tends to work is when a judgment is made, particularly at Supreme Court level, it becomes a legal precedent. So some of the interpretations of the way we do things are based on court cases as well. So there's a lot of things to think about in here again. So it's another real reason why we don't want to be focused on like real specifics all the time. We want to kind of think about how do we break this down into its foundations. The other thing just to bear in mind is personal data. Personal data is any information related to an identified or identifiable natural person. As I said, the keyword there, natural, basically means alive. And real, technically, I guess, like an AI entity wouldn't count as a natural person. Really important word in this one as well is identifiable. So an identified person is you, Matthew, on the call today are identified. I know who you are. Your name is Matthew Jackson. I know what you look like. You're an identified person. An identifiable person might be if after the call I was describing you. I was saying, oh, there was a guy who came along, he was wearing like a blue t-shirt and glasses and stuff like that. Someone might be like, yeah, I saw a guy with blue t-shirt and glasses. Is that Matthew? Yeah, it was Matthew. I didn't know he came to that event. I don't actually have to clearly identify you. I could be giving identifiable information. And that's super important because it means that things like reference numbers about people, like unique reference numbers that you might give to a customer, they count as personal data because you can take that information, combine it with some other information, and there we go, we know who that person is. So important word there. So don't just think that identified information is the really obvious stuff around like name, address, and things like that. If someone is identifiable from the information, that also counts. One more quick example on that. I used to work in a place, had CCTV, had a customer come in, member of the public. The guy was on crutches and had one leg. And it was very obvious that he had one leg. On the incident report, that was called out. There was something happened there. Doesn't matter what it was, but someone had to fill in the form. They identified that the person had one leg. That was then very easily identifiable because you could look at the CCTV, find that person, and then work out who they were. So that one fact there by itself might not seem pretty obvious, like person with one leg. Okay, that could be anyone. There are many people that are amputees in the UK, but actually it can be combined with something else to identify someone. So important word there. Also worth noting, there's something called special category data. This is information you have to be particularly sensitive about. And now this is one of those things where potentially the kind of areas that you're working with, you're not dealing with a huge amount of this. In terms of your customers, and also worth noting that if you look through this list, I won't read through it. So have a read through. There's nothing about like financial data or stuff like that. That doesn't count as particularly sensitive data in the UK or GDPR. It doesn't have its own category or anything like that. Your credit card information in terms of data protection is not particularly sensitive compared to your name. They're treated equally in weight. But these things are given extra protections. So you have to be aware of that. They need additional protections. They need additional reasons to process and stuff like that, which we can dive into if anyone's got questions a bit later. But just generally speaking, if you're processing any of this information, you might need to do a bit more than you expect for other information. Now, I say you might not encounter much of this in terms of your customers. Do not forget your staff. Every organization I've ever worked with processes special category data about their staff. If I take a sick day, you have information about my health. If I put down that I'm married for tax purposes, you have information about potentially my sexual orientation, potentially my sex life, certain things like that. Hopefully not, but you know, anyone can make judgments on that. If I were married to a man, for example, you would have information about my sexual orientation. So there are kind of things in here that you will have about people as employees. So don't forget about that. Your employees have exactly the same rights as your customers. So even if you think, no, why would I know the racial or ethnic origin of my customers? That's not relevant to me. Chances are you might be asking that of your employees for equality and diversity purposes. So don't forget them as part of this. Okay, so we're nearly done with the kind of crash course in data protection before we talk on some of the more practical stuff. So I am going at speed through this. So again, if anything doesn't make sense or is confusing, stop me and I will answer questions. Again, what the law is concerned with is processing of personal data. That's effectively when it comes into play if you're processing personal data. Now, processing, as it says here, covers a lot of things. Strictly speaking, it's collecting, recording, organizing, structuring, storing, adapting, altering, retrieving, consulting, using, disclosing, making available, aligning, combining, restricting, erasing, or destroying personal data, which basically means doing something with personal data. So don't get caught up in the definition of processing. If you're doing something with personal data, even if you are holding it in your hands, you are processing it because you're using it, you're storing it, you're consulting it. So worth bearing in mind that if you're doing anything with personal data, you're probably processing it. So don't get caught up in this description is what I would say. So those were those two things. Just quickly on special category data, one thing I forgot to mention, the way to think about it. So the way to think about processing is if you're doing anything. That's the easiest way to think about it. Easiest way to think about special category data is it's the kind of information that could really fuck up someone's life if it got in the hands of the wrong people. Best way of thinking about it. Which is why trade union membership is on there, for example, or philosophical views. You know, someone being fired for believing a certain thing counts as special category data because someone could be fired for it in certain circumstances. So that's a way to think about that. And as I say, processing is doing. Now, finally, I think I can't see what's coming next on my slides, so I'm going to say finally, but I might retract that finally in a second. It is worth noting that there are regulators. So in the UK, it's the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. They are the data regulator, basically the personal data regulator. But it is worth noting that in the financial industry, the FCA also has powers regarding personal data. So there are certain scenarios where you might need to notify the FCA about a personal data breach. So although we have the ICO, the big ticket famous one, and of course, the FCA is very famous from a financial perspective, it is worth bearing them in mind from a personal data perspective as well, because they often have interest in what's going on with personal data and regulating that as well, and will work closely with the ICO on certain issues. Same like if you're in healthcare, where the MHRA might have a kind of direct link with the ICO. It's very similar with finance. So don't abandon the FCA when thinking about this. Every member country of the EU has an ICO equivalent. They have their own version of it. There is a board that sits above it called the European Data Protection Board, EDPB, but they are effectively the ultimate arbiter of disagreements, really, between individual regulators. So every member state will have its own regulator with its own opinions and its own way of doing things. This is important to note because the ICO is the office of the IC, the Information Commissioner, who is a person. It is one person. There is one Information Commissioner in the UK. Currently, his name is John Edwards. And so his personality has an impact on how it's regulated. It is a petty fiefdom of John Edwards, and how he chooses to run it is up to him. So it's a bit like an ombudsman. Like it is one person, and there's an office supporting him. We have seen, for example, his impact. He took over from Elizabeth Denham. Elizabeth Denham was very fond of tech and loved going to tech conferences, and so didn't really regulate. That's, to be perfectly blunt. John Edwards has come along and has given some really high-profile fines so far. He's coming along with a very different message. He wants to make an impact. He wants to make it clear who's in charge, stuff like that. So that will make a difference. And it means that every member state will have a slightly different way of doing things. So, for example, Spain will fine you for anything. Anything you do that's slightly wrong, they'll fine you. They even recently fined, and I think this is absolutely incredulously ridiculous, but they fined UPS for delivering a parcel to a neighbor's address for safekeeping because the person who was meant to receive it wasn't home. Okay, Spain, they'll fine you for anything. France, they like to go after big American companies. You know, they're often going after Microsoft and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, every country has its personality and its way of doing things. So as much as there is a EU-wide law, and the UK has still kind of got the same law, countries do have different interpretations of things. Also worth noting that electronic communications, that PECR that I mentioned earlier, Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, that was a directive and not a regulation in terms of EU law. What that means is every country had to do something with it and interpret it in their own way and put that into law. That means that electronic communications rules across Europe are different. In the UK, you can send B2B marketing to your heart's content. In Spain, you have to get consent before you do that. In Germany, you have to get consent twice before you do that. So again, worth bearing in mind, that's EU law, treat things for each country separately. And finally, worth noting, America is definitely expanding its kind of reach into the realms of data protection. So, for example, in California, there's now a kind of data protection board for the new law that's coming in play in January this year, which is effectively the equivalent to the ICO, except it's made up of kind of 4 people. There's like 4 regulators. So they've empowered that, and also kind of beyond that, any other states that do have privacy laws like Nevada, Virginia, as things currently stand, the Attorney General is effectively the regulator in those states. And it's a litigation-rich environment, which is why the Attorney General is ultimately generally the arbiter of these things. Yeah, worth bearing in mind that things are changing rapidly in the US. And depending on the final outcome of the elections recently, we will see whether we will have a federal privacy law or whether we'll continue with the complete mishmash of every single state doing its own thing and changing one slight thing here and there to make it basically impossible for any business that works on the internet to just provide a European, US-wide approach to things. So we'll see. We'll watch that space. But yeah, don't forget about the US, who are really coming along. There are, of course, other countries like Brazil, China, etc., that are doing things. Brazil has a regulator, so does China. There's a privacy commissioner in Australia and New Zealand and stuff, but these are the big ones. So always regulated is the ultimate thing to take from this. It's a regulated industry, a bit like finance.
So that's a good question, quickly. I was going to quickly, if I can. I just want to ask, do you think in the future there will be kind of like a global data protection concept or anything like that discussed? Has that ever been broached? Because it seems very fragmented, and that's obviously a big problem, isn't it, for a lot of tech companies?
Yes, it's already happened. It happened in 1981, and I will save the answer to that. I will come back to that because it's going to be important. It's something I'm going to say later. But yes, you're on the right track with it. I'll dive into that a little bit in a second.
Sounds good.
I think it's in about 2 slides or so, roughly. So based on these regulators, what can we do about data protection? The ICO, very helpfully, the UK's regulator, released an accountability framework. This is everything that they expect to see in a business to be able to demonstrate that they're compliant with data protection legislation. Obviously, this is very helpful, and it was designed to try and help business, which is generally the ICO's mantra. They want to make things as easy as possible for businesses. However, it's not It's not very scalable. It is a approach that is quite rigid. This is the things that we expect to see in a business. It doesn't matter what size. It doesn't make any judgments on that kind of thing. Also, obviously, it's UK focused. So it's what the UK regulator wants rather than the world. When we were thinking about this, like, how do we break data protection down into something that is something scalable or something that can work across borders and things like that? We took some inspiration from ISO 27001. Might have heard of this, might not. General thing to take from this: ISO 27001 is part of the International Standards Organization. Key word in that being international. ISO 27001 is a security standard. Data protection and security are different topics. Worth pointing that out. Especially for Ganapathy on the call in the kind of tech space, they're often lumped together. They are different topics. They are different specialisms. Someone good at information security will know sometimes nothing about data protection, and vice versa. However, there's a Venn diagram of a... Sorry, Ganapathy, were you going to say something?
No, that's understood. Yeah, ISO 27001. Yeah, and
yeah.
Data protection.
Yeah. There is a Venn diagram, however. If you take data protection and information security, draw in two circles, there's a big crossover in the middle. So you can take some inspiration from it. But effectively, ISO 27001, how it manages to be international is it focuses on controls and principles and risks rather than specific items, unlike the ICO who focus on specific items and specific things. So taking those things together, let's have a look, and now we get to some of the meatier stuff around the pillars of good data protection based on that. And this, Matthew, is where I will say that has already happened in terms of everyone getting together. I say everyone. That's probably a view that could get me in trouble because it was Europe. Let's put it that way. So it was a European directive, but it wasn't the EU. Or the EEA. It was something called Council of Europe, which is a broader organization that includes countries outside of the EU, EEA. It's a separate thing. They came together in 1981 to discuss this. Now, where it all comes from, just very, very quickly, you may think, why on earth are we talking about this? I just want to know what to do. But this is an important context. It basically comes from a very infamous man of the 20th century, whose name was Adolf Hitler. The concept of privacy effectively comes from the Human Rights Act that develops after the Second World War. And I think it's Article 8. It's either Article 8 or Article 12. And the reason that's confusing is because the EU released one, well, the European, the Council, the European, whatever it was called, Council of Human Rights came together in 1952 and produced their own one, and they changed the article numbers. So it's either 8 or 12 of the Human Rights Act, of the Human Rights Agreement back in 1948, and 12 on the other one. That basically said that people have the right to a private family life. So they have a right to not have their communications intercepted by the state and stuff like that, which obviously, you know, in the back of the Gestapo and things like that, was very much a response to that kind of state influence and control of people. And that's where it all comes from. And obviously, as the 20th century evolves over time, technology evolves, and there comes to a point where countries go, right, we need to find a way. Sweden, I think, puts it in their constitution in 1970-ish. And then in 1981, people have that conversation, Matthew. They go, oh, this is getting a bit confusing now. Why don't we try and bring this together? So the Council of Europe met, as I say, broader organization. It includes like Georgia and places outside of the EU as it stands today. And they came up with Convention 108. Convention 108 is effectively what data protection is. To this day, basically all data protection legislation is based on Convention 108. That is the real linchpin, which is why, as I said earlier, and I said to keep it in mind, the Australian Privacy Act and the GDPR are so similar. Despite being 26 years apart, they're very similar because it's all based on that. So we can use that knowledge and of the fact that it's all based on effectively the same thing, to go, okay, what are the foundations that we can build into a business that can be transferable internationally, so that we're not changing wholesale what we do. We might change detail here and there, but we're focusing on those fundamentals. What I'm going to do now is run through what we've broken down. In fact, there's 7 pillars of data protection, of good data protection practices that do just that. However, after this, because there's going to be a lot of information to take in here, and I'm going to be fairly high level, I am then going to run into, okay, but what are the basics? What are the first things you need to have? What are the things you absolutely need regardless? If we don't do anything in this area, or we only do a little bit in this area, what do we need? So I'll be reasonably high level here. If you've got any questions, just stop me and ask. But I will promise you I'll give you some real detail and actionable steps as soon as I've got through this. So
cool. So
one of those,
Tom,
yeah,
great. These are the trust key pillars of good data protection. They're the ones
they
that you
sure are.
Yeah.
Yes,
right.
They're not an internationally accepted standard or anything. I don't want to give that impression, but these are pulled together from years of experience and from people probably much cleverer than us who thought about these things separately, and what we've done is brought them together. So yes, don't take this as an accepted kind of international standard, but everything in them, it forms part of generally accepted international standards.
And it's worth adding that we've got between 40 and 50 companies that are using this framework to like win contracts, get approvals, things like that.
Yeah.
So it's working.
Maybe it's a matter of time before it is an accepted international framework.
Yeah.
We're just working back from that. Okay, so access control. These are alphabetical, so don't take any judgment based on their order, apart from that's the alphabet. Access control is all about managing access, controlling access. Pretty straightforward in terms of the name of this one. And in fact, you'll find with a lot of these ones, you can swap the first and the last word around a little bit, and it'll tell you exactly what they're talking about. Controlling access is very important to data protection and information security. The reason being is that humans are generally your biggest risk. Most breaches happen because of human error or accidents or things like that. Most developers have incredible access to information. They can often see everything. They hold the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. So controlling access is really important. There are a few things to think about in this area. Make sure that you're able to understand who has access to what and why. That's very important, and generally makes sense to do it as a role-based kind of judgment based on the kind of risks there. But also too much access control is a bad thing. If it's so difficult to get access to anything, I guarantee you're going to have people sharing passwords because it's way easier. I have done that, where I joined an organization that took about 3 weeks to get me access to a system. I had to borrow someone's password to be able to do my job. So we've broken access control by making it too strict. So make sure it's quick and efficient, but obviously that we know who's got access to what and why. We're able to demonstrate that. We've got audit trails and things like that. That's a kind of key area, like I say, of data protection and of information security. So an important one. Also worth noting, there's a kind of broader level to this, which is thinking about who we're giving access to. Like, who are they? There are certain roles that you might employ that are absolutely fundamental to your business, very important roles, and you give them, like I say, the keys to the kingdom. Do you know anything about them? What's their background? Have they got a criminal record? Are you checking that? So there are certain things you might want to think about as well beyond that, around like criminal records checks and stuff like that, particularly around, I'm not picking on them in particular, but particularly around developers who, like I say, often have immense power within the business to do what they want. And yeah, worth thinking about background checks and that. Another key area of background checks is finance roles, for obvious reasons. And they always tend to come up, but people forget about developers and stuff. Okay, asset and supply management. Again, we can flip them around. So managing assets and suppliers. What does this mean? Again, this is one of those areas that has a big crossover of data protection and information security. Managing assets and suppliers is all about understanding where our data is, who's got it, where does it sit. So there's this kind of breaks down into kind of two key areas. And generally in modern businesses, it skews towards the supplier side because we all use cloud systems and third-party tools. We very rarely develop our own internal tools to run things. That's becoming increasingly rare. But your assets are basically all the stuff that you own. And from an information perspective, that's information that you own. So that is information about your customers, your IP, your code, and all of those sorts of things. Do you understand where that sits, where it is, what it is? What are the controls in place to keep that secure and safe, and that side of things? The other side of this is obviously then your third-party suppliers. Who are you sharing this information with? Can they be trusted? Can you prove that they can be trusted? Have you got any information that they can be trusted? What kind of ways have you got to demonstrate that you are working with people who are safe? You could be absolutely amazing at data protection and give your information to another company who then has a breach. Well, what standards did we set before we were choosing to work with them? This is good for two reasons. One, just general business sense, making sure that we are working with trustworthy suppliers and things like that makes sense anyway. But additionally, think about your liability. If you're a controller of data, by law, you're a controller, and you give that information to a third party, who's acting as a processor for you, so they're just processing that information on your behalf, and they have a breach, you are responsible for it as well as them because you're the controller and you chose to work with them. So you're also thinking about understanding your liability in these cases and make sure you're able to demonstrate that you took the right steps beforehand. So an important one, definitely. And also just, again, understanding where in the world your data goes as well, because under data protection law in most countries, where your data is matters. So sending it to Russia at the moment would probably be frowned upon. How do you know you're not doing that if you don't understand your suppliers and your systems and things like that? So yeah, worth bearing in mind. Breach incident management. This is a fun one. Again, managing breaches and incidents. They're not the same thing, just to be clear, but they can be put in the same process. Security incident might have nothing to do with personal data. Personal data breach has nothing to do with your code. So that's the way to think about it. So personal data breach is when you accidentally have a breach of personal information, which is a failure of security that has led to something wrong happening with personal data. That goes beyond disclosing it to the wrong person. That could be losing it, deleting it, altering it, making it unavailable, all of those sorts of things. If you're doing that with personal data, it's a personal data breach. That's important to differentiate from a security incident, which might be someone attempting to hack into your account, or an influx of bots trying to force log in, or some of your code being compromised. That might not lead to a personal data breach, but it's still important to be aware of and think about. The reason you have to differentiate between them is that a security incident that doesn't lead to a data breach has one way of dealing with, and you would want to make sure you've taken the right steps in dealing with that and reviewed it and stuff like that. And you might inform the National Cybersecurity Council, Action Fraud, the police, etc. If you have a personal data breach and it meets a certain threshold, however, you may have to inform the ICO or the country's data regulator, and you may have to inform the data subjects who have had the breach, affect them as well. So there's a different thought process before you do, and then it comes back together and you do the same kind of review and the same kind of understanding of instance. So they're different things but closely related. Accidentally hit the space bar there. And where you want to be with breach incident in your organization is that people treat it like a fire in a warehouse. You're a digital business. Your stock is basically online. It's the equivalent of having a warehouse with physical stock. If you had a factory worker who saw some smoke in the corner of the room, you would really hope that they wouldn't be like, it's just smoke, I can't see any fire, I'm going to leave it. You'd expect them to report that to someone, potentially press the red thing with the glass in it on the wall. Everyone knows what that is. They know what to do. People know they have to leave the building. That kind of understanding level about fires and stuff like that, you want people to apply to data and security incidents as well, because suspected incidents should be reported, and just as much as incidents themselves, and people being geared up to know exactly what to do and when is very important. So ironically, if you implement this well, you should see an increase in the amount of breaches that you hear about, and that's a good thing because it means people are more aware of it. Just speeding on because I'm conscious of time. Change control, very much a security measure as well as a lot of these things are. making sure that you've got safety in terms of changes, particularly in terms of code and stuff like that. What if it breaks things? How do you restore information? What's your backup? What's your business continuity? Do you have an understanding of your like disaster recovery plans and stuff like that? How do you make sure that you are keeping control of these sorts of things? So that's a reasonably straightforward one to explain and one of the more tricky ones to actually implement. But effectively making sure that we've got good control of changes, we've got plans in case of backups and having to restore and all of those sorts of things. We're testing them and they're working well. It's a meaty one. I'm not going to dive into this one too much because I'm going to speak about this one in a minute, because this is one of the really important ones here. All this time we've been talking about data protection. Data protection is fundamentally about the rights of people, and in data protection speak, they're known as data subjects. And these are the things that are going to be basically, what does the law say has to be in place? And I'm going to dive into that in a second because that's important. Likewise on governance, this is a really fundamental one, an understanding in your business of who's got control of things and who's taking responsibility for stuff. Again, I'm going to jump into that one in a moment, so I'm going to skip over that quickly now. Risk management, this one I'll cover a bit high level. Fundamentally, everything's a risk. Everything you ever do is a risk. Coming to this event was a risk. It could be rubbish. It might still be rubbish. It might be good. It's a risk. I made myself a cup of tea before I came to this call. I risked burning my hands, but I thought actually the reward of a cup of tea outweighed that. Thankfully, I didn't burn my hands because I can assess the risk of doing that is pretty low, because I might take mitigating factors like not putting my hand over the cup when I pour the water, for example. So everything we do is risk, and you're in business. And so every decision you make is based on risk. So managing risk might seem kind of counterintuitive. Well, we're always managing risk. What we're thinking about here is, how do we get good at it? How do we make sure that it informs decision-making, strategic decision-making? You know, how do we make sure that this is something that we're aware of and we can judge and we can make judgment calls about? What is that? What does that look like? You know, are we just taking every risk as it comes and dealing with that as a small issue? If so, that's not a strategic level conversation. How do we know we're making the right decisions and we're doing things in the right places? An example of this, we were going through risks with one of our customers, and before we went and reviewed kind of the risk register and kind of the interpretation of things, the understanding of the business is that they had a big risk in this area over here. Let's call it area A. Like this was their biggest risk, and they needed to seriously think about this. As they're going through the risk register, they realized actually that paled in comparison with the fact that they were recently moving offices. They'd gone to a co-working space, but not given their staff any information about taking calls, confidentiality, privacy screens, anything like that. And they were so used to working within their own office, they realized that actually, yeah, they were in the room with lots of other people now, and they were talking about children. That was actually their biggest risk. And only by able to taking that step back and understand that strategic level were they able to say, actually, that's something we need to think about and mitigate. And then there'll be other things that you'll come across. You say, we're going to accept that. That's fine. We don't need to mitigate that one. We're going to move on. Having a risk, knowing it, understanding it, choosing not to deal with it is much better than not being able to demonstrate you had any idea of the risk. So a very important one. And in finance and the financial sector as well, risk comes up a lot. It's a common term, and it's a common thing that people have to think about anyway. So yes, worth thinking about. Is a fundamental part of data protection, because a lot of it, as I said earlier, way back at the start of this, it's all based on principles. Therefore, every response to those principles is a risk decision. So yes, important to bear in mind. So that was a lot of high-level information. And just very quickly, I would say, generally speaking, if you're thinking, oh, that line appears by itself, I don't know why I've done that. That adds nothing to the presentation, does it? But each pillar of those things, you want to aim to have something along the lines of the following. So you want to have a policy. Policies are very important because they're policies, they set standards, but also they're things that you can share. You can share for due diligence purposes. You can share with investors. You can share with enterprise customers. You can make these look fancy and important and interesting, and they will go a long way for you. But no one actually wants to read a policy, really, not even me. I hate policies, and a lot of my job is policies. So think about how we can support those policies. Generally speaking, from a policy that sets a standard, there's a procedure that aligns to it. So making sure we've got something that can tell people what actually do we need to do. No one really wants to interact with a complex policy to find out exactly what to do. how do we break down some of the fundamentals in terms of like procedures, things like that. Make sure people are well trained on all of these things, and that you've got some kind of training in place and you're able to demonstrate that. And generally speaking, don't do the training until you've rolled out the policy and the procedure. Leave that till a bit later, because you don't want to train then roll out, because people won't, it just doesn't have the same effect. You want people to already have interacted with it, understood it a little bit, and then train them on it. And finally, generally, you will have some kind of framework. All of these things will translate to something. An access control policy and procedure in that necessitates some way of managing access. A risk management process is working necessitates some kind of risk register. All of these things will have some kind of output that you need as well to bear in mind. So on that note, like what are the basics? What to start with? And you may be pleased to know that this is pretty much the end of the presentation. So and then we'll stop for any questions. So essentially, you must have at least the basics. That's what we would argue, and we have argued, and we do successfully argue in some scenarios, and I'll tell you about those in a second. Like I said, I would talk about this. Governance, strategic awareness of data protection is super important. Those are things like audits, accountability, senior discussions, those sorts of things. This is fundamental to this working. Data protection is not a one-off thing. It is constant. If you're working in a business that processes personal data, which you are, because everyone does, pretty much everything you do impacts personal data. So it doesn't stop. It's not a one-off product. We can just implement some policies and then take our foot off the gas. You want to have things in place that support this working and building it into your business and your culture. That generally starts from the top of a business. That generally starts from the C-suite, the chief executive, the leadership team. You want to have that as a discussion point in those people, and that they are able to then translate that into things that they want to happen in their team. And then you have accountability frameworks and stuff like that. Like, who's actually responsible for doing these things? How do we make sure that they're working and that we're devolving them across the business, and that people have got an understanding of who does what and things like that. And you want things like regular audits, checking that things are working and improving and going in the right direction. Because without occasionally taking that step, you actually don't know if you've achieved anything. Quick note, none of this has to be complicated. Senior discussion could be a half-an-hour chat about kind of data protection. What are the risks? What are our kind of objectives that we want to achieve and stuff like that every quarter? Accountability frameworks could be as simple as this person is responsible for this person is responsible for that. Speak to them if you need help with this. This is the person you go to when you have a breach. And a regular audit could be very light touch. It could be something that you're auditing, kind of what frameworks did we put in place? Are people using them? You know, have we got evidence that they're being used? What isn't working, and what can we improve? So don't think of this as like really in-depth kind of stuff here. You don't need to go in depth on these things at the start. The other thing you want to think about is, as I said, data protection stuff as all the stuff that's legally required. Those are records of processing activities, retention schedules, DPIAs, LIAs, privacy notices, things like that. Breaking those down very quickly, because there's a lot of acronyms there. Our records of processing activities is that first one, RoPA. It is a record of the processing you do. And there are templates available online. There's different ways of doing this. Effectively, the law says you need to have certain information about information you're processing. So there are things that has to be included. How you structure it is kind of up to you. But super useful document, because it lists out what you're doing generally. If you do it as a kind of list, for example, it will list out what you're doing with personal data. You'll put your legal bases for processing on there. So you've got kind of, we're processing this for contractual reason, we're processing this for legitimate interest, we're processing this under consent. You'll have things like retention. How long are we meant to be keeping this information? You might have kind of links to any contracts or where you're storing this data. It becomes almost your kind of personal data reference point, your personal data Bible, so to speak. So it's really important that you do this and get this right. A, because you need it, it's the law. But B, because it's actually just really useful to have. It will answer a lot of questions for you, such as when we get a deletion request from a member of staff, can we delete that data? Well, let's check the records of processing. No, we're processing that for legal reasons, or we're processing that for contractual reasons. We can't delete that. Or, I'd really love to market to these people. Let's have a look. Oh, no, we actually told them that it was under legitimate interests and we would need consent for that. So actually, no, we need to go and get consent first. Records of processing will do that. Do not start with the records of processing, though. it is almost impossible to translate the abstract of your business onto a spreadsheet. To support records of processing, map out what's going on with the data, really high level. I don't know if either of you are particularly technical on the call. Don't build an architecture map. That's not what we're talking about here. Don't go complex. What's happening? Where are you getting the data from? So people go to our website, they give us their first name, their last name, and their email address. That then goes to MailChimp. We use that to market. Simple as that. Once you've got that map out of kind of what happens across the business, that's going to allow you to translate that into a records processing activity. So don't start with that. Visually map it out. And also, if you are interested in processes and stuff like that, it's quite useful to see. And we've had some businesses we've mapped it out and they've gone, oh my goodness, we do this like 3 times. We could simplify that and stuff like that. So it's useful for 2 reasons. And it will translate the abstract into something more tangible that you can then translate into the records of processing. Records of processing then translates into a privacy notice. Your privacy notice is a translation of your records of processing for members of the public. This is what we're doing with your data. This is where we're storing it. This is why. This is how long we keep it. I say decent privacy notice there. Super important. It's decent. That sounds obvious, but we've all seen the privacy notice as a Acme Limited, open brackets, we, us, close brackets, company number 1127. I mean, that's unnecessary. It's not a legal policy document. It's not a contract or anything like that. It's a notice telling people what's happening with personal data. Yes, there are certain things that has to be included, but if you draft it like a legal document, no one's going to interact with it. If no one interacts with it, it's not a privacy notice, because you're not telling anyone what you're doing with data. If no one can understand it, you're not telling anyone what you're doing with data. And also, it's part of your brand. Write it in your brand voice. Don't be afraid of doing that. Your copywriters who do your website and stuff, get them to review privacy notice and add some taste to it and brand taste and everything. Like, this is not a legal document. Anyone can draft this. Once you've got your records of processing and you know what has to be included, you can draft a privacy notice. Some place to look, you can look at like ASOS, have a really interesting approach to their privacy notice. There's a legal company called Juro, have a very visual privacy notice that kind of went quote unquote viral recently, which as viral as a privacy notice can go. You can also look at Trust Keith's privacy notice. We've got one obviously that's broken down very differently to what a lot of people might expect, just to show there is a different way of doing it, and it can be readable and easy to understand and short. It doesn't have to be long. As is very short, but it tells you everything you need. So worth looking at those, some different examples of privacy notices. Retention schedules, you need to understand how long you keep data. There are certain legal requirements for keeping data. Contracts in the UK have to be kept for 6 years. And then there are other information that you don't have to keep for any period of time. So understanding how long you keep things for is obviously very important, because one of the principles of data protection is purpose limitation, and there's data minimization and stuff like that. You shouldn't keep things for longer than you need them, basically. And then DPIAs and LAAs, I'm not going to dive into those now, but they're effectively risk assessments. They're risk assessments that you can do once you've got your records of processing that will help you identify whether you need to do those or not. Again, they can be really useful documents. If you do them well, a DPIA and LAA can really help break down your thinking over why you're processing things. So if you're ever in murky areas where you're like, I'm not sure whether I should do this or not, DPIAs can be really useful just to think about what you're doing, what are the risks, what kind of things can we do differently, and help you with that thought process. So don't approach them as like an unfortunate hurdle we have to cross. They can be actually very useful for doing so. And finally, make sure you got a breach incident procedure. Kind of goes without saying, make sure you got something in place. This is what you will start with. The reason I said a bit earlier about defending, this is a minimum defensible position. If you think of like a minimum viable product, this is a minimal defensible position. The reason being, you're saying we've got the right people involved at a senior level who are driving this across the business. We have all the stuff we need from a legal perspective, so we're compliant with the law, and we have a fail-safe for if things go wrong. We've got a way of dealing with things if things go wrong. You've created yourself a kind of minimum viable position. When we look at then those other pillars that we spoke through earlier, like access control and asset supply management, you can build off the work you've done here to create those things. And also you can be aware that you've got things missing, and sometimes being aware that you've got things missing is useful in itself, because it shows you've got an awareness of stuff. And when people are doing due diligence on you and everything, trust me, because I used to do it, we can spot whether someone's got an awareness or whether someone's just answering with stock answers or making stuff up. You can see when people are answering honestly and stuff like that. So this gives you, like I said, a minimum defensible position, gets you compliant with, as compliant as possible with the law. It kind of gets you with the compliance on the kind of document side of things. You've got the right people involved to make it a longer term success, and you've got a fail safe if things go wrong. And voila, that was Trust Keith, as you can see. That was a crash course, very much a crash course in data protection, from the kind of fundamentals to how you can then address that. Hopefully useful, at least provoke some thoughts or some learn some new things. Any questions?